Welcome, everybody. It's the last day of the October Gallery exhibition of William Burroughs. And grazie mille. Monsieur. Yes. It's a celebratory last day of the exhibition of William Burroughs, whom we first showed in 1988. And I'm super happy to have this panel discussing some of Burroughs' legacy, but also the legacy of my co-panelists and people whose their work has been about. It is tricky to have a vision that is defined as radical, and the root of radical means root. So a radical vision has to do with rethinking from the very beginning, from the onset of your vision, like what has happened before, what is the situation now, and how can we really create something that's quite new and has not been done before. So radical vision isn't just a political term, it is an artistic and cultural term as well. I'm happy to welcome Neil Bartlett, Ira Silverberg, and Andrew Durbin. I'm Kathelin Gray. I'm a co-founder of the October Gallery, and I've worked in projects that combine ecology and the arts. Andrew Durbin is an American poet, novelist, and editor. His biography of Peter Hujar and Paul Beck is forthcoming from FSG and Granta in April 2026. Andrew is the editor-in-chief of Frieze. Neil Bartlett is a prolific British director, performer, translator, and writer. His last performance was of Derek Jarman's Blue on World AIDS Day at Queen Elizabeth Hall. And Ira Silverberg has just flown here from New York. He's an old friend, and he is an editor and educator, consultant to writers, artists, publishers, and nonprofit organizations. He's now a member of the adjunct facility of the MFA writing program at Columbia, and is working with the chief judge for the Navajo Nation on a book on indigenous rights. Well, I met him when we were both friends of William Burroughs and James Brower Holmes, who's William Burroughs' longtime friend and editor. This was back in 1981. And so we've had many interactions over the years, and very pleased to collaborate with Ira in putting this panel together. Ira will be chairing the panel, and we'll be having a Q&A at the end. I'd like to point out that there is a toilet in the back of the hall. Should anyone need, you don't have to go downstairs. Ira?
This is on. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to look to you first, Kathelin, because we're here because there's this Burroughs show up. It's the last day. I hope everyone has had a chance to see it. If not, please afterwards have a look at the show. You've shown Burroughs before, but now I think there was another reason to do this show and to address legacy. You've done a lot of work in legacy. You've worked with Ornette Coleman. You've worked with Brian Geisen. You've worked with Gustav Metzger. And there's always been this commitment to Burroughs, but why now the Burroughs show? And given the state of the world, why now radical legacy?
Well, exactly. It's, I was impelled to instigate this because of the state of the world, because we're politically, economically, ecologically, culturally in deep, deep shit. And it's even hard to describe the extent that the planet and culture is messed up, shall we say. We're in a catastrophic time, and it's difficult to really think through. And William is someone whose incisive intellect had really thought about the root cause, which is exploitation, the war against nature, therefore the war against other people, the war against anyone who's different, other species, and so on. He is able, through his work, first in literature and his experimental novels and essays, interviews, to articulate exactly how that exploitation works. In the case of culturally, it's about, William's work is about deconstructing thought patterns, in a way, algorithms of the mind that automatically run us. And because of his troubled history, from the time he was a queer and different young man, all the way through to his addiction, to the terrible killing of his wife, through it all, and running away from his background. He kind of got his middle class background in middle America. He was able to dissect all the aspects, and not only to identify, but once it dawns on you what's going on, and it's hard to take that in on a daily basis, what do you do about it? And I think he has a good recipe for deconstructing those thought patterns. And in his painting, which I mentioned we first showed in 1988, but he painted the last 10 years of his life. Not many people know that. But through his painting, it was more like, what do I know that I don't know that I know? How to contact the subconscious, which navigates us all, which is not unconscious. You can have access to it, but through his paintings to access that. And I wanted to show that. And also, he has a long association with the gallery, the founders of the gallery. I've known him since the 70s. I was very close to him. So because of that, and secondly, because of the film Queer, which I was very excited about because it was one of his early novels. William tried to get it cinematized, shall we say, tried to get it to film. And then suddenly there is this Hollywood film, Queer, starring Daniel Craig, and I thought that more people would have gotten to know William because of Queer. So that's why.
And I know how much of Queer you saw, which was 20 minutes? Maybe? I have a problem with the film in terms of radical vision. And that's where I kind of want to go, because when you're working on a book about two people who could not you've been working on, when I first met you, the inspiration from Wild was key to your work in there. There's been this radical, queer thing that has just inspired your work for 40 years, 30 years?
Oh, 30.
And I feel like I can trust the people on this stage to represent the work that they believe in and radical belief systems that they believe in. But when something is interpreted in a fashion that, if I look at that film, I would say it was a pink washing of Burroughs, which is kind of like, how do you make anything not queer, but Guadagnino kind of made it very bougie, if nothing else. What does one do, or is legacy something that one lets go of when it's taken down? I'm kind of curious about that as well. And what do you say when someone's like taking something radical and taking it down a few notches?
That's done all the time.
Bring it on.
All the time. Yeah.
I would say nobody panic. Nobody be surprised, right? And always look for the other outcomes. So Queer as a piece of writing, so the Burroughs novel, Queer, didn't need that movie to be assured of its ongoing relevance or indeed entertainment value. It's a fantastic read. And so the good thing about the movie is because it's got that ravishing poster of Daniel Craig leaning up against unspecified male body, both unclothed, entire swathes of queer kids, for want of a better generic description, are going to, in exactly the same way as, so for instance, one of my favourite novelists in the world who I constantly reread and have done since I was 12 is Genet. Why? Because I grew up in the most conservative and unradical place in the world, a small town in the south of England. It had a bookshop. And on one of the shelves there was a picture of a man without a shirt on. I stole it. It was Our Lady of the Flowers. Here I am. It's that simple. So the good news about that film is, like a virus, that poster is going to bring the work of this writer to untold numbers of young people who really need him. Young people of any age, I should say, because the need to rediscover your roots or to question whether you've got the right roots or do you need to find some new roots because your parents didn't give you the right ones, that isn't something that only happens to 19-year-olds. If we take life seriously, we're going to keep on asking those same questions. So that's the good thing about the movie, and Daniel Craig's body is always a good thing, and we should spend more time looking at it. I mean, it saved pressing pause on the budgie smuggling scene from the Bond movie. I thought the art direction on the process shots was absolutely ravishing. The reconstruction, how to do chromolithographic postcards from the 1950s, wonderful. I can't remember anything about it. I was really confused. Who's the famous actress who's in it? Leslie Manville. Is that right? Is it Leslie? Because I came out and I turned to my husband and said, I thought Leslie Manville was going to be in it. And he said, yeah, that was the weird person in the jungle. I went, okay, great makeup in that case.
Can I respond to that? Because I guess my issue, I didn't see the film, so I'm going to start with that, and I'm coming out of a cold, so I don't know if this idea is going to make any sense. But I was thinking about like what clothes that body of Daniel Craig in the film and why, and that kind of gets to maybe the heart of why I didn't see it. And some of the issues I have a little bit with the film, the idea of the film, and also I guess what's left of a radical queer vision, the name of this panel. Because I was thinking about how I don't really know what radical, I don't know how to define radical. I don't know how to define a radical vision. It's one of those things that I know it when I see it. I think of all of you as radical, but I couldn't sort of list out what makes you radical. But then I was thinking a little bit about the first time I encountered Burroughs as a young person, and I think I was maybe 15 or 16. I picked up Naked Lunch at Barnes & Noble in South Carolina, where I was raised. And I was thinking about that book, and the other book that impacted me so much as a young person was Susan Sontag's Against Interpretation. Those were like the two key texts for me. And the thing about both of them and what made them radical for me was how unreasonable they were as books. Against Interpretation is a totally unreasonable argument for a critic to be making, but it is so wonderful, and it makes it so radical because as a young person you're asked to contend with this nearly impossible idea. And Burroughs, ditto, you read a collage novel, sort of pseudo-collage, and you read about the cut-up technique and you think, if you try it, if anyone's tried the cut-up technique, it is ultimately the crappiest way to write a book. Like, you will only write utter trash. You will not get Naked Lunch if you did it 1,000 times. But it's unreasonable. It's so fun to think that he did it this way and to kind of buy into the myth of it. And I was thinking about what makes that literature so great and what makes literature so great is the accessibility of it, that anyone can kind of pick this up and they can latch onto these ideas. And I guess what frustrated me about the film was to clothe these characters in such expensive designer outfits designed by Jonathan Anderson, put them and the story and Burroughs in literature out of reach. And I'm so angry at that. I'm so angry at how David Wojnarowicz has been appropriated by designers and put on a $3,000 sweater. I'm sort of emotional.
Also Jonathan Anderson.
Yeah, and I don't want to knock on him because this isn't just him, but I will knock a little bit. It's painful, actually, to see what's left of a radical vision is a $3,000 sweater, or a film starring a really wonderful, and I don't want to denigrate, I mean, there's more to Wojnarowicz than the sweater, but in some ways, for many people who are looking at fashion, that is what's left. And so I guess what I struggle with the film is that putting it out of reach. And that's what I really worry about with the way our culture circulates nostalgias about legacies, about even the idea of IP. It can be very frustrating. I won't go on, but that's sort of where I'm at with it. I want to get back to things being unreasonable again and sort of shoddy and, like an adaptation of Burroughs in which they're clothed in a charity shop rather than Loewe, but that's me.
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to what's driving this society, which is exploitation, and that there's this tremendous appetite for anything. I mean, I was in San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury in the Summer of Love, and quickly that was taken over by the media and songs and so on, and even now you get little flower child thing, but it was all about shattering the world entire and creating a new world closer to your heart's desire. I mean, I wanted to start a new civilization, full stop. A shoddy one, a thrift shop one, but a new civilization. But everything is just eaten up by this tremendous Moloch, and it's mining in Bolivia. It's David Wojnarowicz. It's William Burroughs, even, but you have to remember what's driving it always.
Yeah, then I'll let go, but I think what we need to I just wrote this book that deals a lot with the 1960s about Paul Thek and Peter Hujar, and Paul Thek is really famous for this work in 1967 called The Tomb. It's more famously known as The Death of a Hippie. And he buried a wax replica of himself in a giant pink cigarette. And right after that, and one reason why it kind of picked up the name Death of a Hippie is because the Diggers, who were a group in Haight-Ashbury in the 1960s and 67, they were so frustrated with this particular media narrative around the hippie and the kind of delusions it was creating in America's youth around what it actually meant to live in San Francisco, that they staged The Death of a Hippie.
I was there.
Oh, very good. You can speak about it. But I've been thinking a lot about how we need a death of a hippie culture in some ways. Like, we need to be more comfortable with burying IP and burying.
That's what I loved about Gustav. Sorry.
No, please.
That's what I loved about Gustav Metzger. His famous auto-destructive art. Gustav Metzger. If you don't know him, look him up after. He said it was just somebody. He just said he was the most important contemporary British artist. Full stop. He did the deconstruction in art symposium in the 60s, and so art has a timeline, a beginning. Materiality has a timeline, but there's this perpetration in museums and so on. Oh, we've got to protect this, we've got to restore and restore and restore. Gustav was that this is a life form, it has a beginning, middle, and an end. And the flip side of his auto-destructive art was the auto-creative art, which people don't remember about his ethos. That art is part of a culture. There's life and death in this thing. So Yes, let's bury whoever needs to be buried.
Even ourselves.
Yeah, I was, yeah.
In time. Wild. Why? I mean, and why has Wild continued to be this presence who's thought of as you know, it's a really bourgeois culture that has taken over. Certainly, you know, the gay culture. I mean, we can talk about, you know, the art world and how it's beyond bourgeois. It's 1%, and these radicals still live on. You've spent a lot of time with Genet, Wild. Like, what is it that you see that's keeping the vision alive of these people while the culture is becoming just kind of more interested in currency?
Well, to riff on something that you said, the primary experience when you encounter the work, and I don't think I'm the only one to say that it's not uncommon to encounter genuinely head-screwingly radical work when you're very young, right? Kids find things by accident, so whether that's Oscar Wilde or Jean Genet or David Bowie or whatever, that primary moment when you realise there's an entire world that they didn't tell you about, and something about that parallel world you intuit would be a great place to live. I mean, I'm caricaturing this in very simple terms because I'm trying to remember what it was like for me. So when I first encountered that paperback copy of Our Lady of the Flowers, I felt how Genet himself talks about reading Proust for the very first time, which he did when he was still just very recently out of one of his first prison visits. So he's very young, he's 17. And he talks, and people don't take it seriously. He said, someone gave me, he doesn't say who, someone gave him a copy of Proust. He said, I read the first 2 pages and I knew the rest of my life was going to be all right. And that secret communication from someone, you don't know who they are, probably the only thing you know about them is they're either dead or they're unimaginably distant to you by virtue of their fame or their cultural background or their cultural practice. But you intuit, they speak to you in a way which you cannot account for. So in my case, I come from the most conservative culture really, in a way that this country over the last century ever produced, a completely Philistine town. I didn't see a person whose skin wasn't white until my second year at university. That's how strange and Philistine my world was as a child. And I was at college, I was trying to survive the disparity between, I was living this wonderful, glorious life of an unbelievably great education system that had brought me from nowhere to Oxford University. I'm living in splendour, in unimaginable, beautiful medieval surroundings. I'm having a marvellous time, and I'm dodging the police because I'm queer. I'm trying to put those two things together, and then I discover I'm living literally next door to the room where this person called Oscar Wilde lived, who was sent to prison because he got caught doing what I was doing, having sex with people he shouldn't have sex with in hotel rooms. So of course, I felt he could help me because he'd been through it. And I think that's when the radical speaks to us. In that very simple way, it takes our hand. I mean, that was the thing that struck. I've just reread Queer because I thought I ought to do my homework right. And I went, it's a really great, straightforward, queer, positive novel. It's it's wonderful. It's saying, yes, yes we are, yes we can, yes we do. It's fabulously witty, it's fabulously straightforward, it's fabulously sex positive. And of course we're told either that Burroughs is this sinister, depraved, murderous junkie, or he's a very important, very, very important avant-garde writer. You couldn't possibly understand him unless you're also very important yourself. And I go, no, I would give that any, when I'm teaching, often if you're one of us and you're teaching, you get young people saying to you, please help me, what can I read, what can I watch? I would give queer to any 14-year-old. Yes, here you are. Be assured that there are another set of roots, to use your point about what does radical actually mean, because our ancestors are not biological. Our ancestors are cultural, and I was given a certain cultural ancestry, mostly to do with the Church of England, some of which turns out to be great, by the way. But my real cultural ancestry reaches from a direct line back to Mr. Wilde. I mean, you asked about Wilde originally, Ara, because his life is incredibly like mine. One of the things I really like about myself, I'm 3 sexual partners away from Oscar Wilde, which I only found out quite late. No, and I don't ask because I've agreed with the last one that I won't share that story. And I literally live next door to him. I walk the same streets. I talk the same language. I share vocabulary with him. So the radical roots of that particular queer culture, in my case, are not mysterious, really at all. They're extremely immediate, and they continue to be.
You fairly recently read the entirety for Fundus, which is like 6 hours by Oscar Wilde. That must have been incredibly moving for you.
Yeah, if you watch the film of me doing it on YouTube, you will see I break down irretrievably several times because it was unbearable. That's what I mean about immediacy.
You did it while he was interred, was that?
I was reading De Profundis in the chapel of Reading Jail because Archangel, very wonderful, radical, genuinely radical cultural agency, took over Reading Jail for a few months. They borrowed it from Reading Council, and they invited different artists to respond to Wilde's history in that building and the other histories of people incarcerated in that building, which was used until 8 years ago to mostly accommodate 13 and 14-year-olds who were. The last occupant of Wilde's cell was a 14-year-old who was kept in solitary confinement there. So I read that. That was tough, but also great. Yeah, it takes 6 hours and 18 minutes to read it. It was wonderful. It was one of the best things I've ever done, I think. And I mean, that was testament to how immediate the legacy is. There were about 30 people came and went all the way through the thing. If you watch the film, you'll hear people coming up. But there were about 30 people who stayed for the whole 6.5 hours because they felt that close. And that's what you're looking for, is for the radical to take your hand. This legacy, your legacy sounds quite abstract. It's more like fandom, where someone who's dead is really your best friend, in the sense that without meaning to, they have accompanied you, and you can turn to them and say, how do I feel now? That's why rereading things and re-encountering. I mean, sorry, I'm going to shut up. But last night I was in Stratford-on-Avon. I went to see they're doing a new production of Marlowe's, Christopher Marlowe's play Edward II. Now that's something else. My copy of Marlowe is something I bought when I was 13 from a charity shop. It was 10p. I've still got it. And it was so great to see that play, which I'd never heard spoken out loud. Because again, that's something I've read every couple of years since I was 13. So that's 53 years that I've been reading that play. And again, I sense my own cultural tradition in the most vivid and straightforward and affirming way. One of the really interesting and great things about being queer, certainly my experience of being queer, is people talk as if this legacy was fragmentary and underground and difficult to access bullshit. I've been surrounded and affirmed by queer culture since I was 13, in all its glory, from the transsexual round the corner to Janae and Wilde and Mona, who are all having dinner with Bill Burroughs in heaven right now. Caravaggio, Jarman, Burroughs, Wilde, Janae, Hujar, Marlowe.
And Hildegard von Bingen.
Absolutely.
In the age of cancellation, Burroughs' history comes up. This is Lynn Tillman, a writer and a dear friend of many of us on the panel in the room, said, asked me, how do you ignore the killing of Joan? And a couple of texts which have been considered misogynist by some. And I mean, personally, I think there's to go black and white in any of this is just, it negates history, but I was asked to bring this up, and I respect the question. When someone has done something that is seen as anti-humanistic or misogynist, and they're coming from this place, how do we, or how does one on this panel explain that to somebody else when we live in such a polar space in terms of how we interpret the lives and work of artists?
Do you have an answer? I don't.
Let's hear your answer.
Ooh, I will not have an answer that will be coherent. Probably because we don't. Yeah, I mean, my feeling about it, well, specifically to Burroughs, I read him before the advent of Wikipedia, so he was sort of cemented in my mind before I knew too much about the death of Joan, which, if anyone isn't aware, he, in the early 50s, the 40s, he played a game of William Tell with his wife Joan and put a shot box on her head and shot her. He killed her.
And it was an accident, but it was still.
Yeah. And I
when I make my comment, I'll
okay.
elaborate on that.
Anyway, Ira, you wrote a very beautiful piece for New York Magazine about queer and about Burroughs' legacy, and you touch on this, which I'd love to hear you speak more about. I don't have a good answer for this, I'm sad to say. My own personal tolerance for artists' bad, abhorrent behavior is sometimes maybe uncomfortably high, in the sense that I accept that people, particularly in the past, can do terrible things and still produce interesting art. It maybe informs my reading, and I may choose not to engage with that particular artist if they've done certain things. I'm very nervous about, and I think we may be in different ways exiting or complicating this culture, I'm very nervous about the kind of cultural erasures that have happened around particular artists and writers and legacies who have done, who can make us uncomfortable and who've done horrible things. Caravaggio would be like a good example, stretching all the way back. And particularly I'm curious about the recency bias in cancel culture, because 20th century people often don't get a pass, but 1918th and onward do. So I don't know. I'm not very interested in conversations around cancel culture. I'm glad that Lynn raised it. I know she is more. It's something that I just, in my own kind of weak intellectual way, shy away from. So that's sort of where I go. But maybe, Kathelin, you have something to say about at least the death of John and how it informs Burroughs.
Yeah. Well, I read Burroughs when I was a teenager, and when some friends and I were starting up this new civilization of ours, and we decided to start up an institute. And what would we do in this institute? Meet those people that we wanted most to meet on the planet. I said I wanted to meet William Burroughs, so I wrote him a letter and then picked him up in the Albuquerque, New Mexico airport. We drove up to where the conference was. We had a flat tire, which he helped change. And when we got to this kind of funky adobe ranch where this new civilization was going to be born, with a geodesic dome, of course, I said, "What would you like me to call you?" And he said, "Call me William. I must know what is your attitude towards women. Because it's not only shooting his wife, it's the novels and so on." And he looked, we were standing face to face, and he said, "I killed the only woman I ever loved." And he started crying, and then he started sobbing. And he talked about her and talked about what kind of an influence she was on him and what a great woman she was and the mother of his child. And we really didn't talk about it again until 1988, when Kathy Acker had done an interview of him here. But because I knew him, and I knew that he knew he had done something irredeemable. There's no coming back from that. He couldn't just delete that from his life. He couldn't go, he couldn't rewind, he couldn't do anything, it was done. And how as an artist, which he became after that, not before, but after. He was a smart guy before that. He was a troubled guy. He was a cultured guy, but he wasn't an artist before that. And he went into artistry in order to discover, for one thing, those deep, dark places, because they exist in all of us. Otherwise, we wouldn't have, once again, this planet that is trashed. And the people who think they're doing good, or they've had a great life, sometimes are the worst offenders. The missionaries in the South Pacific, for example, or wherever. So he used that feeling that there was not a day that went by, multiple times in the day, that he didn't feel that horror at what he had done. But he used that as a leverage, in a way, to understand the imp, the perverse, the ugly spirit that possessed all of these characters that make up the multiplicity of the so-called individual, and then which ones are enabled in the culture, which brings us back to what's going on now with Trump and everything. It's that, or in Second World War, the Holocaust, people are disinhibited. These characters, dark characters that live within, are disinhibited, and they rule. And so you can read his books and understand about those characters. And then his paintings come from a different point of view, which is doing the paintings and understanding what it is that he knows and he doesn't know that he knows. In other words, that's in the subconscious. He discovered those things by looking at the paintings after they were done. So it was the healing time of his life. Right.
Thank you. I it's always a tough one, and a lot of us are imperfect. But I'm happy to have brought this up because we've all done horrible things in our lives. I hope many people I know is to have, and it doesn't take away from the art, and that's what troubles me. What's happening with that particular aspect of the culture right now, and the erasure of people due to transgressions. I mean, what's a transgression in one century isn't in the next. I mean, I think Kathelin really spoke to the personal reckoning there, and I don't think we'd be having this conversation if he hadn't canceled. So that speaks to something.
And it's in the work. I mean, that's what's so big. Even he in a way. So I was struck rereading Junkie as well. I was struck by how much there's a serenity to that prose, which you don't often find in his later works or the middle period works.
Yeah,
at all.
In the early works.
Yeah. But there's these eruptions constantly of the moment where he starts thinking about centipedes, or there's always something lurking beneath the surface.
Naked Lunch to get some queer.
Yeah, exactly, completely. And I was thinking so much about how, I'm not quite sure how to formulate this, but I was thinking about what you had written in your particular piece about this ugly spirit, and that how it animates so much of his thinking around that book and that particular moment with Joan, or the death of Joan. I guess I would love to hear more about it was so interesting to hear your story of meeting Burroughs. Now, he talked about it, but in your own experience with him, not to hijack the questioning, but how he spoke about it with you, and how he thought about, I guess, women in his work as well.
We didn't talk about it, it was there. And when James Grauerholtz and I put together the selected writings, we did an anthology called Word Virus, we had to deal with it was there. We had to deal with some of the more misogynist texts, and we gave him this manuscript. It was this thing, and it was 6 weeks before he died. And we handed this thing, and there was a question about what we should call it. He said, well, we should just call it Just for Jolly. Those were the words of Jack the Ripper when asked why he did it. And I thought, that's not bad, Bill. It's because it was in that way he was kind of releasing it all. It's all there. Judge me as you will. Say what you will about the work. This is what I did. This is what I produced. I think William was a very complicated person. And I think the death of his son, who died on his second liver after a transplant of alcoholism, was probably as, if not more painful, because he had killed his mother. Billy always felt abandoned, wanted to be a writer, and I think Ginsberg was more available during many of the years than William was, because William was here in London and Alan was at home. And I think William died with quite a lot of regret, but who doesn't? And those were the circumstances of his life, but it fueled the work. At the same time, I think that ugly spirit is also the thing that keeps us coming back to a lot of writers, and that that we're working out our own stuff through reading them, and I'm really comfortable with it. I mean, when I saw that movie, I kind of saw a lot of people's deaths, just in that scene, and what a dark world it had been. But it's also been the inspiration that's got me, in publishing and working with writers. So it's nuanced for me, but it's tough. It's tough. I mean, I get this all the time from people. It's like, how could you have spent so much time with that man? He was a wife killer. I said, I know. What else are you going to say? It's a tragedy. But it's good to work it out. I think. I'm kind of curious about with you two. Cultural responsibility is something you've both taken on in your practice as writers, because I think what you're doing is you're actually bringing back or making present or keeping work available. And I feel like as the kind of commodification of whether it's queer culture or any alternative culture, any outside of culture eventually becomes commodified. It's the hippies, it's the queers, it's a radical of any kind becomes a t-shirt or a meme. Do you feel responsible to kind of get out some more pure version of whether it's Peck or Hoojar or Wilde? I mean, do you feel like this is part of your own kind of ethos? Is this, because I kind of feel like we all, I mean, the thing that pissed me off about White Nina's film was it's like, you fucking fag. It's like, this is this like dark queer writer, and you've turned it into this like, you know, la-di-da, like lifestyle film. And I thought, that's bullshit. If you have any responsibility to the culture you come from, you don't do that. You call it for what it is, which is like, this shit is dark. And I thought that was just like a crock. That film is just, you know, kind of, you know, dressing. What do they call it? You know, something, lipstick on a pig or something like that. And I'm just curious about where you think our collective responsibility is in terms of keeping, you know, what's dirty and getting it out there.
I'd never express it like that. I would never say, well, in my considered cultural opinion, I would go, yeah, but I think that's boring. Whereas the artist you're talking about is fascinating, upsetting, a potential source of great obsession and enthusiasm, and your version of him is just frankly dull and you're only in it for the money. But you can't go around talking like that, because then you get into a load of trouble. But the problem is always to what extent one's work, my work, is considered. So my work, like anybody else, well, no, not like anybody else's. My work is a mixture of enthusiasm, I love this stuff, so I'm going to do it, and random opportunity. Where do I get offered the space to do it, or where can I construct the space to do it and find the space to do it? And eventually, if those two things align, then I have been lucky enough to do a series of extraordinary things and earn my living writing books and putting on shows. But it isn't as if I sit down and go, today, as a responsible cultural producer, I will think about X, Y, or Z. Speaking for myself, it's much less considered than that in the moment of production. With hindsight, of course, I do the complete opposite and will say, yes, I have spent 40 years deliberately working to preserve and foster certain, I think, invaluable radical traditions in British queer culture. But that's only when I'm doing things like this, when I'm smartly dressed and I'm trying to pretend that I'm, you know, that sort of considered reasonable senior cultural producer. When I'm making the work, I'm scrabbling around in the rubble with a bunch of fellow queens, trying to deliver something on time, on budget, and when we're lucky, it really works. So personally, I think it's important to be really honest about how that works and the multiple ways in which it works, and something I'm very clear about in my own practice and the way I talk about it is not allowing there to be a hierarchy of importance in cultural production. So it is not true that it's more important if you're doing a posh thing than if you're doing a grubby thing. So it is not more important to have a play on at the Royal Court, which I've done, than to be prancing around in a jockstrap in a car park in Vauxhall, which was what I was doing last month. There isn't a hierarchy to these things. There are different kinds of value. Personally, I think there's more value in the car park practice just at the moment, although at the time, the Royal Court show was pretty good, Simon Mellor, sitting here, produced it for me, and that was pretty good. It was, what year was that? 94, because it was just before my mother died. So in 94, we put on a show at the Royal Court with me fronting up the show and being kind of respectable and clever, but backed by a chorus of the most disreputable queens that we could possibly have assembled, and they were fantastic. So, yes, I think when you talk about the importance of legacy work, I want us to talk about it. I want us to be humble. I want us to be practical. I want us to be generous. And I want us to be informed. So to acknowledge the breadth of different kinds of legacy. And not to worry, don't worry about the movie. No one's going to remember that movie, right? No one's going to remember that movie. A lot of people are going to remember the first time they read the book. And few, you know? And of course, what's happening is a lot of very powerful people with vested commercial interests are going to try and argue the opposite. That Burroughs' writing only became really culturally significant when Daniel Craig put his sweater on. That's, isn't it? He entered the mainstream. Don't get me started. Never use the word mainstream in my presence, because it's all going to go wrong from then on. It's complete horseshit, that idea that only when cultural production, you know, becomes sanctified by commerce, does it have real agency. I personally think it's exactly the opposite, because the quality of experience is so low.
Well, the French kind of responds more to what's going on in a legitimate and authentic way than anything that's being produced by the center of
I prefer the word better. Legitimate, authentic. I go better. You know, when you see a really great artist doing their stuff, it's fantastic. Going to see a big commercial movie, even if it involves Daniel Craig taking his clothes off, don't get me wrong, it's still not quite the same thing.
So I have two adjacent comments that are not totally on the topic, but one is that William didn't discriminate amongst his fans. Anybody who was a fan, he was going to sign a book. He was going to, he got this gig, we were talking about this. William made more money off of his art than he ever did on his writing, off of his painting. He made more money off of a Nike ad than he did with everything else combined. And William Burroughs didn't sell out, he did this Nike ad, but he was like, with me, he was like, he called me honey. Honey, I can try to get you a Nike ad too, so you can buy a house or something like that. But it was also William Burroughs just out there. He was who he was, and a lot of people at the time saw that Nike ad, and I think he would be thrilled. Here we have a great biographer of William and others, cultural historian Barry Miles, so he will tell us his opinions in the perception after this, but he would have loved that that queer was made. I think he would have loved it, and he would have loved that it was out there, because it's a wormhole. It's a wormhole back to not only William's ideas, but this whole the root of radical is a wormhole back to the root of radical. The other adjacent thought I had is kind of disturbing to me, and I've had this life participating in the founding of, instigating of, whatever, cultural and ecological and scientific projects, so it's quite different than the disciplines that we're talking about, in a sense. William was very involved and interested in that, by the way, but in the course of doing these projects, it was very messy. it was a very highly collaborative, and anybody who has done very intense collaborative ventures knows that collaboration can be fucking hell. It can be hell. It's rough. It can, especially if it's long duration collaboration. You know, you've got to, you might not like the people, you might like them and not like them, and then there's a, so it's very much in the dirt in terms of getting something made and getting the money and all of that. But then after it's made, and this is where it's disturbing to me, is when you're letting people know about it, it's got to be this grand project. This, look at this great project. You know, I mean, when we got this building that the October Gallery is in, it was, we had to get down there in the dirt, and my colleagues are back there, and Chile remembers running crews, getting the rot of the building, all of this, and the arguments and this and that over the years. But in the end, it takes on a life of its own. But when you're talking about it, you don't talk about being in the dirt and all the petty crimes that were committed interpersonally or whatever. You talk about the project itself. So in my latest years, I've been more focused on the glory of those projects, when in fact the being in the dirt is probably, and talking about that is perhaps more interesting.
I want to get to one of your projects, if we can, because one of them is probably one of those radical things that's ever happened on the planet in certain ways, which was the Biosphere 2, creating a space that one could export as the planet falls apart to another planet. A project that was radical because it acknowledged that the Earth had the potential to be destroyed by its own inhabitants. Today, when, I think it's fair to say it's a bleak time again. We've been through many bleak times before. That project was hijacked by the very powers that are destroying the world today. So I'm wanting to get to whether there's hope, writ large and writ small, in the realm of keeping great ideas alive, and where you see hope from that project, but also in the arts, when people are feeling completely beaten down by the systems that are kind of creating these little fascist states all over the world. And it's a leading question, obviously, but I'm very curious about that.
Well, I think Neil addressed that well when he was talking about, you find that novel on the shelf and you get the juice that's there over the generations. I think it's about when you feel that feeds you. That's what it's about, more than keeping this abstract legacy alive. It's about, in my mind, and I've thought a lot about this, particularly recently, it's about the stuff that's communicated. It can be over the centuries, but also just in live theater, in live, the pheromones, the experience that somebody who said, hey, you gotta read Genet, and it was in that, or with me, the babysitter said, oh, I was 14, there's some books on this shelf you probably shouldn't read. And this thing. But it's about
and which
that
books?
Naked Lunch, for example. Henry Miller, for example. All of which I read, of course, and changed my life. So, in terms of Biosphere, if you think of it as a utopian project, and this is the largest earth science project ever made, it was this kind of a mini Earth under domes in the desert in Arizona, where 8 people were sealed inside for 2 years. It was it wasn't so much about what you were talking about, the purpose. It was more about let's study complex life systems. Let's create a laboratory for life systems. Study scientifically how over a period of 100 years, how these life systems interact with each other and what role humans have within this biosphere, this ecosystem. That's what it was about. But the narrative in the press became sort of refugia. This is where, when everything else is destroyed, then the rich people are going to go into that. That was part of the media narrative, and living through that and seeing it wasn't a utopian dream. Utopia means no place, but it was about this is our best shot to what we can do at the time. To understand ecology, understand the planet. And I think it's about that. It's not about hope in an abstract sense. It's about empowering. It's about example and interesting narratives, writing. That in itself, the story of Biosphere 2 is, if it's inspiring to someone else, that is where its value is.
Thanks. I'm just curious, who have we missed? Who hasn't been brought back in terms of inspiration at this time? I mean, there's constant rediscovery. There are people we've all worked with who suddenly are inspired with new inspiration. And there are a lot of people who've been, a lot of radical work, a lot of writers, painters, people in all forms. Who's the next? Who do we need right now?
I guess my question would be like, what, bringing them back from what, and like how do we measure where we're bringing them back from? Because, like for example, I might name some certain names, but half the room might know. Or what is the measure of them being back?
Audre Lorde seems to have this kind of wonderful resurgence right now in terms of just she's been getting for a really long time infusing life and work with erotic and really kind of explaining away the kind of the tropes around, especially women's sexuality and black women's sexuality, and infusing a life of sex and eroticism into the world that we shy away from in our very kind of puritanical place. The Audre Lorde thing happens every 20 years. Every 20 years someone is quoting Audre Lorde, but for instance, and I think there are other writers who were rediscovered. When I brought Iceberg Slim back into print, I felt like there was a certain black vernacular that people were waiting to have, or Ballad of the Dolls for that matter, which is kind of this trashy book that really spoke to women's sexuality. And I just think that there's a kind of ebb and flow of what people need at a certain moment.
I have a name. Other than Paul Tech, who we should all learn all about if you don't know anything about it. But I've been reading a lot of James Purdy. And I would consider him not back, at least in a kind of, Luca Guadagnino's not going to make, maybe he'll make In a Shallow Grave, but, hopefully not. But I would bring that back because I've been thinking a lot. I had not read much Purdy until about 2 years ago, then I read the short stories, and then I kind of picked up from there. And his vision of an America that is so dire and complex and depraved and also beautiful and infused with this kind of atmosphere of sex and tragedy, I think is so appropriate for right now. And, when I saw Liberation Day in the Rose Garden with Donald Trump and thinking about how he's going to pave over the roses with concrete because he doesn't like stilettos going into the grass, it was an amazingly kind of Purdy-esque moment for me. You could totally imagine a kind of wealthy, eccentric, maybe an older woman, maybe a drag queen, you're not quite sure, paving the rose garden because she's quite tired of her high stilettos sinking into the mud. And what I find is so beautiful about his particular work is how the tragedy never ends. There's not really a resolution to it. It goes, during all this controversy around Alice Munro, at one point her agent wrote her a letter saying, I think we've reached the basement, and Alice Munro said, there's a sub-basement. And that's true for Purdy, and I think he's for me, the quintessential, if you're interested in the United States, but also beyond, I think he's the quintessential like voice of this moment, and I would love to see every book brought back because I think it would really inform what we're going through right now.
That's great.
Yeah, what she said, James Purdy definitely. Tony, tell me if I've got this wrong, but when I go to heaven, I'm really hoping that there is cinema where you can see all the movies that were never made. Derek Jarman was in negotiation to make a film of James Purdy's In a Shallow Grave with Narrow Rooms, with Debbie Reynolds playing Mrs. Vasey. And she actually had read the treatment for it, so I'm hoping to see that. Yeah, look at
That is incredible. That is the dream, actually.
Yeah, so there you go. Yeah, so James Purdy. I don't think he ever went away. Yeah, Derek Jarman is back right now in a big way. He never went away, but he's back for a whole younger generation. Alfred Jarry. So if you've never read any of Jarry's novels, I would recommend Messalina to start with. You might have heard of his famous play, Ubu, but he also read some really great novels. So I think Alfred Jarry, because he is the sub-basement. He is. So I was in conversation with, he wrote a play called Ubu the King, Ubu Roi, insane, super surrealist, scatological, unstageable piece of filth about an idiotic moron who takes over the world. And I was in negotiation with a major London theatre to do a production of it, and they've just said, we can't do it because the news has outstripped Jerry's imagination by a mile. By a long mile. And they're right. There's no point in doing that play. But the novels are still 2 steps below your most insane and humiliating fears. So I recommend them warmly.
Anything to?
Alfred Jarry, read Alfred Jarry. I second that.
Shall we turn it over to?
Yeah, let's do a Q&A, shall we?
If there are questions, this is the moment.
Are we going to do microphones?
Yes.
Should we? Oh, we've got a roving one.
And I'd like to hear a little bit more about Derek Jarman, by the way, in his context.
Thank you. Thank you so much for what you said. I want to say something quickly about the next question, Burroughs and women. We see in his novels so many scenes of, or the odd scene of marital objection and that horror for polluting female substances. But we have characters like Maria de Fuentes, or Hirondelle de la Mer, or even these women in the so-called underworld. She names the price, she does not name another. Well, that's, for me, as a reader and as a woman, those characters were so important, these polarity, that horror of what a subjective female being could be, which was taken up brilliantly by Kathelin later, versus what free female beings could do. That is there in the novels in such a powerful way that I want to say, and I do say that to students sometimes, to people, deal with the personal life of any author. Know that so many of us were saved in their physical survival and in their mental health by people whose personal life you might not want to know about. Deal with it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I was really interested in the concept of the death of the hippie, and I'm thinking about what we present as radical and the who, how, what and why. And at the moment we've got a major exhibition on at the Tate of Lee Bowery, and it's like, for me, as a peer and contemporary of Lee, he was just one of many radical club kids running around London. He wasn't any more radical than any of us. He was racist and not very nice. And I don't know, for me, and not an artist, a muse, and I find it very strange that we're presenting this person that actually didn't do very much as something really radical, and that's the legacy. And then my other thought in my head as well is, I've been involved working with like the remembrance of the Gay Liberation Front in London. But the reality of the Gay Liberation Front, which we've all got very excited about, and we've loved them, and we've made them icons, and they need to be, and they are important. But actually the GLF lasted for 18 months, and wasn't the first march in London of gay people. The first march in England was up north, and it happened about a year earlier. We don't remember that. We don't remember the campaign for homosexual equality. Really boring, but probably changed a lot more than the GLF ever did. So it's just, it was my thoughts.
Just to come back on that, absolutely the work of legacy is ongoing and complicated and detailed and involves historical research and a constant process of discrimination and judgment, and all of the things you're saying are great, and we should all be, for me, I think the thing is to be saying and. I love that so many people have said to me, have you ever heard of this guy Lee Bowery? Hello, yes. It's wonderful that show is so packed and that young people are getting excited and they're being exposed to that work. And the next stage is to tell them, that was all really normal. There was a group of about 200 people and they were all doing it. And for me, like for you, there were better dressed people than Lee and nicer people than Lee. But hey, that's fine. Get excited about Lee, but then keep on finding out. And as you say, by all means, get right up on your high horse about the GLF and go and see the new movie and be really thrilled and excited about that. And then please go and find more, because it is really important that people know that was, one of the biggest bugbears of this whole question of legacy is the obsession with origin. The first really radical, the first really queer, the first really important. Well, it's all a load of nonsense. All of these genealogies go back and back and back and back. All people. I had a conversation with someone in Stratford after the show, and they said, deeply patronising, isn't it amazing isn't it wonderful that we can see graphic and honest gay relationships in the theatre these days? I go, did you read the programme that this play opened in 1582? What kind of moron are you that you've just flipping watched it, don't you know? And that wasn't the first. So always be saying and. There's so much more to discover and to complicate and reassess.
I just want to echo that, because as I was writing this book, like for example, the GLF was something I spent a lot of time researching, and I think remembering that these legacies are not fixed and that they don't sort of narrow into one personality or one particular moment. And I think that's something I talk to a lot of people about who are thinking about writing history or writing nonfiction, is to remember that there is so much beyond these particular narratives that we're told and that are ultimately rehearsed for us again and again. And I think that's really important. I always think about the famous sip-in of Julius's in the West Village, and how it was actually the third bar they went to that day because the other two refused to arrest them and kick them out. And I always think about how like an amazing play or film would be actually the other two bars where they're just sitting there waiting to be kicked out. But I think that all of those moments, those kind of prehistories or sub-histories, even GLF and how, you know, the problems within that organization ultimately created STAR, which was the Street Transaction Revolutionaries, and all these different groups, which often those narratives get sort of collided into one, or they become quite subservient to something. And so, yeah, I'm always encouraging people to kind of to not hold these legacies in reverence, and maybe to think about what, like, my own work with writing has been to really challenge this idea of reverence and to kind of make a history or a legacy that I thought I knew strange again in my own mind, and to look for the things that I didn't know or don't know or can't know, and kind of start from there as much as from what I do know.
Yeah, and whole civilizations have existed that are either just being discovered or will never be discovered. In the jungles of Yucatan and Chiapas, underneath the pyramids, in Southeast Asia, you know, pre-Cambodia, pre-Angkor Wat. There have been all kinds of peoples everywhere. And so this idea of legacy and the idea, it's a very limited kind of, I mean, in a way, it's, that's why the indigenous societies honor the ancestors of a given place, whoever they may be. And as something that we were talking about earlier, even in this room, your book, Address, what was it called?
Address book.
Address book, yes, where you talk about what these walls have heard. And I was telling you about a story I met, a famous cancer doctor. We were talking about death, and he said, there's no death, just as there's no life, just as every person who's ever been in this room and whoever will be is here right now with us. And it's the same in a room, it's the same in this spot of the ground in London. If you think of all of the waves of society and the individuals and their personal and their group wishes and yearnings and objectives and their art, and then you expand to the cosmos. I mean, this is, we have to remember that context, I think. And at the same time, if you're looking at legacy and continuity, the myth of Gilgamesh and how the most accurate rendering of the story was by oral history, from grandmother to grandchild over a period of 5,000 years. And when they dug up the tablets, it was word for word what grandmothers were just telling each other. So it's complex, this legacy, but we shouldn't get too focused on this culture's legacy.
And also to remember who narrates legacy for us. Because, I mean, to your point about civilization, I mean, if anyone hasn't read David Graeber's book, The History of Everything, one of the most striking bits is the extent to which there were civilizations in Central Europe that were discovered by Soviet archaeologists, but because Soviet and Western archaeologists weren't in communication, we just didn't know that. And we're re-entering that world where huge swathes of knowledge and histories are about to become inaccessible in different ways. And I really worry about the ways in which, you know, I mean, Burroughs talks about this all the time, this idea of control, who controls the story, how do you escape control? The characters in Queer are seeking the age to kind of get out from under this control. And I think in so many ways he's talking about history and ideology, and that's something that I really think about in relation to that.
Do we have any more questions or comments? Jim. Yeah.
Thanks. It's like a comment and then a question. I'm that person, I'm so sorry. The comment was, I wasn't totally satisfied with the conversation around Joan's death, if I'm honest, because like Burroughs gave a number of conflicting accounts of that night. One of them obviously was a William Tell story, which I found obviously highly unconvincing. There was other accounts like he dropped the gun, he was blackout drunk, he didn't think it was loaded, maybe Joan was suicidal. obviously the relationship was on the rocks, he was seeking a divorce, and their 4-year-old son was in the room. So like, I don't know. I feel like there's a danger of sanitizing that. It always gave like this Oscar Pistorius and Rita Steenkamp, like as a story. I think it's often worth reflecting on Joan's loss as a writer, and the way that women were treated by the Beat generation in general. Like Joyce Johnson is a really good comparison, and Katie Bennett has written really well on all of that. So that's my kind of comment. The question, which is a genuine question, I teach queer literature at a university, and I teach a lot of the writers you've been talking about, like people like Wilde, Kathy Acker, Edward Carpenter, Bell Hooks, and I've always kind of adopted a, like, not gay as in happy, queer as in fuck you approach to teaching queer literature, and it's really struck me how much the kind of generation I'm teaching really bridled at that. Like, they found it really uncomfortable to be taken to transgression and anti-capitalism and anti-colonialism as kind of synonymous with queer. And what they wanted from me, I realized, were stories of like self-love and integration, just like happy, positive stories, because they were sick of always being marginalized and put in a kind of monstrous position, I think. I think that is changing with the mainstreaming of transphobia, really, and young people realizing that actually you still need to fight, like it's not over. So yeah, my question was, the title of this talk, What's Left of a Radical Vision When It's All Come True? It seems like the title should have been like, how do we revive a radical vision when it like emphatically hasn't come true? And yeah, I kind of wanted to ask about the thinking behind the title and like what we can do as people telling cultural stories, kind of reviving the stories of writers, celebrating writers and artists of the past to keep that radical vision alive.
Yeah, when it's all come true, like the radical vision often is in the context of a big mess. And during a big mess, you clarify your vision, like this is really important. So in a way, there's a transformative vision there, but what has come true is your worst nightmare, that what you have contributed and your colleagues or a movement then, and what they were fighting about is become even stronger. Yeah.
I don't think it has all come true yet. Yeah, like when I first read the title, I went, oh, I wonder which it means. Is it, oh, everything we ever wanted as queer people we've now got, in which case I go, excuse me, have you met me and my friends, particularly my trans friends, and my friends with trans kids? Or does it mean the very worst that we ever feared has come to pass, in which case I go, you think? Sorry to spoil the party, but no, the next 10 years are going to be much worse than the last 10 years, and so on. How do we keep on answering the questions of your students? Persistent hard work and brilliance, we're all doing what we can, and the one thing is to say, of course, I respect your primary need as a young queer kid for someone to tell you that life's going to be okay. Of course, and that is our job as their elders. But dear young person, you must not confuse this with what you see on the television, where most adverts now contain a mixed race queer couple doing happy families over car settee cereal product. You must not confuse those two things. So we have a really difficult job because the odds are stacked against us. We've got this on the one hand, we've got the iniquitous, you've never had it so good. So please, why are you still banging on about this stuff? Surely we got that all sorted out in the 2000s, or was it the 90s, or the 1960s, I can't remember. But anyway, it's all fine, relax. Or the equal and opposite, why are suicide rates still going up? It's really, really tough. Don't worry, the ancestors are on our side. There are lots of us. There's not just you, there's not just me. And also, in some countries, like ours, the law is now on our side. And when I started my career, most of my work was in one way or another technically illegal. And I was. That's not true anymore, so we've got to keep on capitalizing on the freedom that this brief window of legal freedom that we have, for myself as an artist and you as someone in the education sector, we've got to lean on that strength. And so when I panic, and I'm guessing maybe you do too, that's what I lean on, where I go, it's not 1989 when I'm being given a job by Newcastle Polytechnic. Before they'll sign the contract, they take me into a private room and say, so listen, before we sign this contract, you've got to agree to never talk about this project in public, because otherwise we'll be liable to prosecution. That is no longer the case, and it didn't stop me then, and it didn't stop them from employing me, and it was a fantastic project. But, so don't make the mistake of thinking the bad old days were really impossible, but equally don't make the mistake in thinking the right now is impossible. It's tough, but it is not impossible, and if queer means anything, it means possible, for me.
The next question.
Hi. Thanks. I came here, I was going to pick up on this when it's all come true, because I don't think anything's come true yet. And I think what William was doing was, he was always looking for some kind of truth, and he was more interested in his science actually than he was in his art. No, that's wrong. He did examine a lot of things, and one of the things he talked on at the conference in 1980 was the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, and he picked up on a weird little piece of science which is to do with insects and these some animals like the axolotl, which don't quite make it in their metamorphosis to become what they were supposed to be, and particularly with insects as well. Neotinic, I think it's called, neotides, and they never quite transform. And he felt that human beings hadn't done that, and he saw that the mind was the place where humans have got stuck in their development, if that's where you're going to find your truth. And the delightful image is they gave hormones to the axolotl, and it promptly lost all its gills. It did do some kind of show, and in a way, ayahuasca, I think, is possibly the kind of hormone you give your mind to try and go up there, where to go. So I think the whole point about this is nothing has come true yet. We've just got to keep looking for it.
Right. Next question. No, we need to. We take one last question.
I was gonna add on this because I feel like this will also be a good ending question. Basically, as both previous the audience said, we've been talking about legacy, like radical vision and legacy. But my question is, with all of this cancel culture today, and people, kind of being not easily talking about anything radical, how are we supposed to let these radical visions of today come out? Do you think institutions or like people in power need to have hold responsibility to push these new culture, new ideas, or are we supposed to gather as again an underground community and support each other?
Both.
Yeah, well,
Yeah, I think both. I think not relying on institutions is really important. I mean, I think that's how these visions we've been referring to in different ways they flourished in some ways, but I also think we have to acknowledge that we live in a very difficult moment in a city like London. It's virtually impossible for a young person who just wants to make their work and do that without having to work a brutal job and can't live in the center. So I think it's really a challenge. I don't think there's a good answer to that because it's really systemic.
So I'd like to say we need to stop the questions for now. But please stay, there'll be a reception downstairs. It's the last hours of the Burroughs exhibition. Please speak to the panelists, introduce yourselves, and participate in our celebration of radical visions. We're celebrating radical vision. Thank you so much.